Hello, everyone. Depending on where you're joining us today from, a very warm good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to have you all with us for this lifelong learning webinar. Thank you also for some of you who've already sent in your questions and comments. Do keep them coming as we go along with this event, because we do want to make this discussion an interactive one. As we mark International Women's Day 2022 this month, our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Even as we continue to struggle with the ramifications of COVID-19, the ravages of war have been set in motion. Before we start today's webinar, I want to take a moment to reiterate the message from the INSEAD Dean, as well as from the NAA President, which many of you would have seen earlier. The school, together with the INSEAD Alumni Association, stand with Ukraine and all our students and alumni around the world who are impacted by the war. We're working together to support those in need and are encouraging alumni to help where they can. Our thoughts and prayers are with all members of our INSEAD community, their friends, families, and everyone else in the larger community who is affected at this difficult time. As with the pandemic, war too will probably impact the most vulnerable sections of society most negatively. But we must hope for the best and work together as responsible global citizens to break the bias in line with the theme of this year's International Women's Day and bring down barriers, fight hatred, and build a better, peaceful, and equitable future for all. Our endeavor will be that our learnings and discussions from today's webinar will be one step in this direction. We will start with a presentation of an exciting new case set in Mozambique, which exemplifies how barriers were broken and biases were mitigated there. This will feature Professor Zoe Kinias. Zoe probably needs very little introduction to this group. She's the Associate Professor for Organizational Behavior at INSEAD and also the Academic Director of the Gender Initiative. After the case presentation, we will continue the conversation with a panel discussion with two other very special people who are deeply engaged with us at the Gender Initiative. We have Dirk Leighton, MBA 89J, and our champion male ally. Dirk is on the executive committee of the INSEAD Global Women in Business Club. In his day job, he's also managing director of Levant Capital Management, but we keep him really busy at the Gender Initiative. Our second panelist today is Kay Formanek. Kay is a big supporter of INSEAD. She's spoken at various alumni and campus events already. She was managing director and partner at Accenture for 25 years, where she sponsored the EDI practice. She's also the founder of Diversity and Performance. She grew up in apartheid South Africa, which shaped her thinking. She's the author of the recently published book, Beyond D&I, Leading Diversity with Purpose and Inclusiveness, which we will be talking about today. Good to have you with us, Zoe, Dirk, and Kay. Welcome. So without further ado now, Zoe, over to you to present some of the key aspects of your very exciting new case.
Thank you so much, Vinika. It's really a pleasure to be with this panel and with all of our audience today. I'm going to be sharing, if we can advance to the next slide, please, about a story that we started telling fairly early during the COVID disruption. And this was an interesting case. We, as case authors, end up with these stories in various different ways. And this is the first time that I was contacted by a participant in a program. This was an INSEAD Gender Diversity Program participant who said, "We love the program." She'd done it with a colleague of hers. "We love the program, and we noticed that you don't have any stories featured in Africa. And we'd love to be able to share with you some of our experiences working in this space." And so this is really a beautiful opportunity for us to share about a story of how the main best practices that we often consider in other contexts. Living in Asia for 13 years, I have a lot of stories from here. Jennifer Petriglieri, who co-directs this program, is British and has been in France for a long time as well. And we tend to have more experience in these contexts. And this story was really a learning experience for me, as well as an affirmation of how generalizable some of the things that we know from other contexts can work in lots of different places. So if we can advance to the next slide, please. I want to start by framing the context a little bit for you. So this case is set in what we call a major logistics hub. We've anonymized the name of this organization, but I can share that it's the Mozambique headquarters of a large multinational logistics company with headquarters in the Middle East. And this is one of their big African locations. Now, the story is told from the perspective of multiple people involved that I'll share with you in a moment. But first, I can tell you that this is a context that everyone involved recognized was a bit different from the contexts we often talk about in business school, leadership cases, maybe set in banks, consulting firms, the little bit more polished contexts, if I will. This is a little bit of a rugged industry. You can see some images that are taken from a location like the one where this story is set. And a few things that are important regarding this context is that when mistakes happen in places like this, it really is a matter of life and death. When people drop one of these big crates, you know, very bad things can happen. And so there's a very strong culture around safety, and that is a top priority in this location. It's also a physically rugged environment. There's heavy lifting involved. There are big cranes and these types of machinery involved. And as you might be gathering from this, it's a little bit of what we'd consider a masculine industry in itself. It's not 100% male dominated, but it is one of the more masculine industries. And being in Mozambique, for those who don't know the country so well, a few things are important here. It is an ex-colony of Portugal. It's on the eastern coast of Africa, just above South Africa. And it is a major connector between South Africa and the Middle East because there's a port that goes along there. And it's been a strategic location for some time. It is an economically disadvantaged culture. So many people are underemployed or looking for work. And it's generally a challenging context to be in. So before we launch too directly into the story, I'd like to put up our poll for the session, just so we get a sense of how similar or different is the context at Logico that I just described to where you all are. I see first answer was very different, a couple very different, some similar, some different. Okay, so we have a good diversity of perspectives here, which we were expecting. So at INSEAD, although a lot of the stories we tell are in more sort of polished contexts, we know that we have a lot of students, executive participants, and other people involved in our community that are in the heavier industries. So this is great to see the dispersion here. And I notice only 6% of our group is in a context very similar, both with respect to cultural context and industry. So for those who are farther away, I'd like for you to just keep in mind that it is a little bit of a tougher context, so to speak, along lots of different dimensions. And yet, though we see that, there are some elements of the story that I think resonate across lots of different industries and lots of different cultural contexts. So I hope that as we're talking through this story, you can reflect a little bit on how the elements of the story that we see here would play out in your context as well. If we can go ahead to the next slide now. Now, the story starts with Logico getting a new CEO. And this new CEO is a European man who has worked in Mozambique off and on for some time. So he has some good local knowledge and experience. And he has worked in this type of industry. But when he arrives to Logico, it's a very technologically advanced context relative to those he's been working in before. And he had discovered in earlier work, both within that region and globally, that there was a benefit to having more gender balance. And so one of the first things that he did, he started in January of 2020. We all know that only gave him a couple of months before the COVID disruption began. And he told us about starting, and sort of people looked at him a little bit like he was crazy when he suggested one of his first strategic initiatives being to develop gender diversity and inclusion in this context. And so he talked to HR, and they said, okay, we'll try if you want to do this. But they found quite quickly that there weren't a lot of resources for getting help in their local context with this development. Where many of us are located, you can sort of find a diversity consultant. There are many folks around who are willing and able to support these changes, and there were not. And so he reached out to someone that he knew from some time earlier. It's an organization called MOVA. If we can just click so we get their visual up. Now we can see there's a little bit of a culture difference between Logico and MOVA when we look at these images. MOVA is this sort of funky nonprofit organization whose primary mission is to help develop female youth who are underemployed. So these are women who are working without contracts. They're doing sort of cash-based, uncontracted work for people and may or may not get paid, these kinds of situations. And so their primary mission is to help these women to develop more stable earning within the Mozambican culture. And one of the things that they do, so there's two elements of education that they do. They help to educate these young women, and they also strive to educate the people in their cultural context, including young women and young men that these young women are interacting with. And so they have this model, for how to educate young people to be more inclusive and more sensitive to gender dynamics. But they hadn't worked in an organization like Logico before. And so we have this fascinating situation of two very different cultures connecting to try to solve this problem, while there's also a brand new CEO trying to lead this initiative. So if we can advance to the next slide, please. I'll talk us through a little bit of the key players in this story. So the key players here are, first of all, we have Christoph, who is the pseudonym for our CEO that I told you about a little bit already. His top leadership team includes Antonio and Alex, who I'll tell you a little bit more about as our story emerges. And Laura becomes the head of HR sort of halfway through our story. Working for Laura is Teresa, who is the project lead for this particular initiative that Christoph has asked her to run for him. She's also relatively new, but she has one quick success story already under her belt with respect to her job at Logico. So she's already gotten some credibility, but she's young and not a gender inclusion expert. Then the consultants that I've depicted here in orange are Anne-Marie, who's leading the project on the consultant side, Luis, who is one of her key facilitators for this project. And then there are also additional facilitators who are part of this story. Now, when we think about this cast of characters, there's a few things that are really interesting in this mix. We have most of the people who are in positions of power within Logico, like most of the organizations. This part should be familiar for most of us, are men, it turns out. And so we've got a lot of masculine energy running the organization, and we have a lot more feminine energy coming from the consulting side. But one of the things that we think is really magical about this situation, and there were challenges, to be very clear, there were challenges to this, this mixing of cultures. But one of the things that was really magical is that they were able to bring a very outside perspective. Oh, I just saw a question in the chat pop up about, do you want to, so I know somebody's asking about my own experience in Mozambique. I have never been to Mozambique. I don't want to misrepresent myself here. I have done a lot of reading and a lot of research about this cultural context. And it's interesting because finding out really sort of the heart of this story can be a little bit challenging, to be honest. There is some information that paints different pictures depending on what types of sources you go to. With that in mind, I think that when we're trying to understand really what's going on within a culture, it is important to read local voices as well as international ones. And there is one source that I found particularly helpful for understanding women's experience and women's expertise that we cite in the case. And this is the story of a, I want to say he's an Oxford PhD who's originally from Mozambique. So he's writing in English and he's able to analyze the context and tell the story of the history and the experience with a British feminist lens, actually. But he also has the local knowledge and the local expertise. So I consider him to be sort of a translator and a local insight, as in addition to the more Western sources that we have, sort of country level comparative data from sources like the United Nations and so on. So I won't misrepresent myself. I would have gone had the timing been different, but this story has all been told during the COVID disruption. So unfortunately, I was not able to go. But back to the characters here. We have locals and foreigners. We have men and women all in the mix here. And for this story, we really wanted to get the perspectives, not only of Christophe and Anne-Marie, who are the sort of, in some ways, the most outside to this story, but also the stories from the perspectives of Luis, who is the local facilitator and was really, I see him as a critical bridge in this story, as well as Teresa, who's our other key informant, who is, she's local, she has her feet on the ground, she's the one who's actually managing a lot of the process. And I can say that if Teresa had had less wisdom and less commitment to this project, the story would not have unfolded in the way that it did, because she brought a few pieces of really brilliant expertise. If we can advance to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about how they engaged in this. So Teresa was really critical to the initial diagnosis. So she provided a lot of the consultation for the consultants about the context for them to understand how to engage with this group. And then after this initial diagnosis, they started developing an application of some of the pedagogic tools and the work that they did in workshops with the youth that they had been working for previously for this industrial context. And they said that a couple of things stood out to them, is that first of all, the folks at Logico didn't have as much time and patience as the young unemployed youth, right? So they had to really balance attention between some elements of their process involved thoughtful reflection, sort of presenting information and giving people time to develop their own views about it, relative to more sort of PowerPoint slides and we tell you how it is type of learning approaches. So it was very sort of gradual kind of process that took a lot of patience. And the MOVA folks told us that there was a strong impatience at first, like, tell us what the KPI should be, is something that they kept getting asked in the beginning. And they said that they actually questioned if they should adapt and make it more sort of corporate for them. And they decided to stick to the tradition that they had found worked in the other contexts, and to keep the pace a little bit slower and more gradual for the unfolding of the understanding of the gender dynamics to be more gradual and natural. So then after this, these workshops, they defined the priority areas in which they wanted to address. And this is something that we see as best practice across lots of different contexts. So we sometimes want to do these initiatives top down, but we see in many contexts where they're most effective, it's really an integrative process between the top leadership saying, this is what you need to do. Now help me figure out how to do it best within your area of control and your area of expertise. And so they did a lot of this engagement up and down, and really collaboration across departments on these key priorities. So then they designed action plans, and they concluded, and they also did this mix between the top leaders and the middle managers, because we know that the middle managers, again, across lots of different contexts, the middle managers can be the toughest. They have a lot to manage, point number one. And point number two, they don't always see as clearly the benefits of this as the people who are in the very top leadership levels. So that's something that really resonated with the other contexts that we've worked with before as well. And then after this, Teresa was very excited that the final stage of the initiative was the recruitment program that she really led under the advisement of the MOVA team. And if you can advance to the next slide, I'll share with you how this worked. So I was just talking to another organization, a technology organization in the APAC region, and they don't have this problem that that Logico had with over 3,000 applications for these 10 jobs that they were hiring for. Gives you an idea about how desirable these jobs are. But they actually said that they thought they made the job ads too broad, was their subjective experience. They got too many applications. But when we think about best practices for recruitment, having job ads very open can help us to get more diversity of applicants. People don't limit themselves from applying when we have broad job ads. And so they got all of these applicants, which was so wonderful, because then they were able to very carefully and thoughtfully carve down to the 10 that they ended up hiring by using the best practices that we know work for working through that pipeline. And so they used gender blinded processes wherever they could throughout this, which is of course a best practice. And they also clearly defined what the criteria for advancement were before they tested who got through, which is another important best practice that we know from the very rigorous academic research and also from organizational best practice. And another thing the couple things that I really like about the endpoint here is that first of all, Christoph thought it was very important, and HR agreed, everyone was in alignment that the line managers had to make those final hiring decisions. So the team would get it all the way to that point, and the hiring line managers could help to develop the criteria, of course, along the way. They were very involved in that. But at the end, they made the final decisions. They ended up hiring 6 out of 10 of the new hires were women. And Christoph invited quote unquote, all of the line managers to mentor their new recruits and made their success a critical KPI for their next year. So they said, you need to now invest in these folks that you've hired, which I thought was, we don't see that frequently. I mean, it's sometimes sort of a hand wave to it, but he did quite seriously, which impressed me. And if we can advance to the next slide, I'll just share a couple of key takeaways so that we have plenty of time to hear from our other folks. Now, the first thing that I want to share here is that the way that they did this iterative process between the CEO saying this is an organizational priority to the senior managers and the middle managers really figuring out how to enact this, it was not developed as being just something that's a diversity initiative. It was integrated into other culture change aspects. So they didn't say you need to develop key priorities only with respect to gender. It's say, what do we need to improve? Communication emerged as another thing that needed to improve, a culture of respect. And this was part of that. And they saw these as really complementing each other and being aspects of the organizational development that would sort of improve upon each other. So it was integrated in that way. And the second takeaway that I wanted to share with you today is that when we're thinking about, of course, we want to be following best practices, what the current understanding of best practices are, wherever we're working, but we don't want to do this blindly. And so, sometimes I hesitate that folks have a hammer, and so they see nails everywhere and sort of think that this is the solution that we need to be using. This is sort of the new thing that we should be doing with respect to whatever problems we're trying to solve. But when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we do want to think about how to adapt and integrate within the specific contexts where we are. So thinking about both of those is important. And then the last key takeaway that I want to share with you is about this inclusive participation across levels of seniority within the organization, across different departments and units within the organization, and across members of different demographic groups, because it is important to make sure that the voices of both the people who are most going to benefit and also those who might feel that they have reason to resist. We need to really integrate everyone in those conversations in ways that are effectively facilitated. I mean, it's not helpful to just shout at each other with respect to these things. We need to have these conversations be engaged in first, and also well facilitated. And I think that MOVA did a nice job doing that, even though it wasn't all easy for them from all sides of the story. We know it wasn't all smooth and easy, but they were able to engage in that authentic way. And I think, should we pause for questions now, Vinica, and then we'll share about the Alumni Impact Survey in a minute?
Absolutely. I think that'll be great, Zoe, because we are getting quite a few interesting questions already. So maybe we'll include a couple and then we can go into this. That'll also give us a chance to connect with the others. So first of all, big thank you for condensing the story so effectively. I know it wasn't easy. It's a very interesting and involved case. And I think I love this case because it sort of presents such an inspiring example of how a determined male ally can make things happen. And of course, the fact that it's set in Africa, for all the reasons that you mentioned earlier, makes it very important to us at the recently launched INSEAD Africa initiative, where we're looking for stories like this. So thank you for writing this case. So a quick follow-up question, Zoe, first. Just, tell us a little bit more about the motivation of Christoph. I mean, he's the CEO but this is a change initiative of a sort that's not exactly typical, as you were saying, for this kind of industry. It's quite a remarkable sort of protagonist for a gender imbalance correction story. So, where did that come from? Tell us more about that.
So thank you for asking, Vinica. And it's funny because I must confess, I had a moment of hesitation. I always want the primary protagonist to be a person who has the subjective experience of exclusion. I think that's important, that we diversify the stories that we tell in business leadership. And Dirk might want to say something about this when we get to the questions as well. He and I have had this conversation before, where being inclusive with respect to DEI also means being inclusive to members of majority groups. And the fact that there are so many European men who are in positions of power within organizations inspired me to say, I think this is a story that we can benefit from hearing. So on why I was still excited to tell the story, but what about him? So there are a few things that he shared with us. The first one is that I think his mother would self-define as a feminist. We did not get an opportunity to interview her, but he told stories of being a child and saying, excuse my language, but this is the way it was said. Young boys will sometimes tell each other, don't be a pussy. And his mother said, that is not an acceptable thing to say. This is not, this is disrespectful to women. It's disrespectful language. And it implies that that women are not as good as men. It's not okay for you to say that. And so he told us stories like this. He also told us, his mother was also a community leader where they grew up. So she was it was a small community, but she was leading it. So he had that model of female leadership as a child and a young man. And then he also told us a story of having really what shocked him experience when he'd been working in an earlier organization where he was walking with a female staff member. And it was it was in a warehouse where all of the other people working were men. And he says that everyone in that warehouse stopped what they were doing to stare at her. And as he was walking with her, he said how that it made him feel physically a little bit sick and terrified. And as a man who's in a position of power within this context, he says, if I had that experience, I can't even imagine what that would be like for a woman. Like, this is not okay for women to have this experience at work. And so he describes that as being a moment for him when he realized that his learnings as a small boy at home were very relevant in the context where he was working. So he had the foundation, and then he'd had that pivotal moment. And he also says that he doesn't have hard data that increasing data, gender diversity and inclusion will make a difference for their revenue generation, right? Like he can't speak to that within the organizations that he's worked, but he says that the culture improves. As you get closer to balance, the culture gets better, and that's what he wants. So he wants to work in a place where he feels safe and other people feel safe and respected and valued. And so he sees it as beneficial really for everyone. So thank you for asking on that. Maybe I talked a little too long. I get excited sometimes in response to these questions. Yeah.
No, but that's wonderful. That's exactly why this case is so interesting, because you see the passion of the main protagonist and where he's coming from. So that's really useful information. And just while on the subject of important people from your cast of characters, moving on to Teresa now, because again, she had a very important role to play, as you said. So what are some of the insights that we can take from her management of the project, at Logico?
Thank you, Vinica. So she did a few things that I think matter everywhere, but I think maybe matter a little bit more in cultural contexts that can be a bit more hierarchical. And she asked Christoph to come for the start of each of those workshops that MOVA did with them. And after he looked around and saw that everyone was there, to get out. And so I think it was culturally appropriate there, but also would be in many other places to say, I'm paying attention, I'm monitoring this, but I also want you to feel comfortable to be honest and like do this. I'm not going to micromanage the process, but I'm going to make sure you know I'm watching and that I do care about this. So that's something that she recommended, and the MOVA team very much appreciated. They said that it wouldn't have worked probably if she hadn't suggested to him to do that. She also really helped the MOVA team to figure out how to adapt what they'd been doing within the organization. So she gave them a lot of strategic suggestions. She also recommended that they bring those top leaders and the middle managers together when they did. That was something that I think the MOVA team, not having as much corporate experience, probably wouldn't have thought of. So that was her suggestion, to say, the top leaders were starting to get nervous that the middle managers might be starting to organize something that wasn't going to be aligned with what they wanted to be doing. And so that cross fertilization was also her idea. And she did have, she brought her own expertise. She had studied HR. She had gone to one of the best universities in Mozambique and she had also been studying for a master's degree as well. So she was very ambitious, very motivated. And so she engaged in a very special way, and also was able to bring some insights and suggestions from the industry and also from the cultural context. So I think both of those contributions were really important for her. And I realize we're starting to get into Kay's time. So do we want to maybe transition, or do we want to ask one more question and then what do you think, Vinika?
I was going to bring in Dirk and Kay now, if that's okay, and then maybe go back. I'm sure we'll have a number of questions coming in regarding the case. So and I think if we have all three of you involved, that will be really good. Did you want to talk through the alumni impact survey, or should we?
Oh, so just very quickly, it just takes me 1 second. I wanted to share that we have launched our second alumni impact survey just a few weeks ago. This is an opportunity for us to learn about and celebrate the impact that our alumni are having. I know many of you on this call today are alumni. So if you have seen this but haven't gotten around to clicking that link yet, please do. If you have not seen the link, you can, it should be sent to the primary email address that we have on record for you institutionally. But if you haven't seen it, you can send an email to the address that we show here. We do want to hear from you. The report will be out in a few months. We'll start sharing those findings with you. So we want to hear from as many of you as we can. Thank you, Vinika. And if you want to just click ahead to the last slide, there are a couple of supplemental materials. If you want these, just take a quick screenshot and then we can maybe do all faces for the rest of our time together. Thanks.
Thank you. And we can share the supplemental materials with all the participants subsequently. Okay, I think let's bring in our other panelists now. If we can probably stop the slideshow and just let everyone see the faces of our wonderful panelists. So I'm going to move quickly now into a question for you, Kay, because I know, this, of course, the case resonates with all of us. And it also sort of touches upon aspects that you've covered in your book. So first of all, personally, I'm sure you could relate to many of the aspects that Zoe touched upon when describing the case study, given your own work, and also the fact that it's set in Africa and you're South African yourself. You spent a lot of time in different parts of Africa. So just maybe quickly first, tell us your thoughts on the Logico story. What struck you and what resonates deeply?
So thank you very much. And certainly, Zoe, I listened very curiously about the story. And this is what resonates. Many people, when they look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, they have a sense that it can be a global top-down. And in fact, diversity is not one size fits all. It is something where one has to be incredibly focused on context. And what I like about the story is here's a global organization, but they have a specific question in Mozambique. And what they need to do is to understand what is the pace, what is the involvement, what type of diversity are we actually looking at, and who's going to advocate it. So what I also liked hearing about is actually the project manager. I have seldom seen diversity journeys being successful without two aspects being in place. The top down, often I call it the CEO evangelist, someone who believes in it authentically. But at the same time, you need to have the champions, the ambassadors, the people who are going to make it happen, who circumvent the issues. So I like that very much. And I think what is also very important about the story is that many organizations, when they start the journey, they want to do it in a straight line. It becomes something pretty academic. We've got a goal. We want to achieve a percentage, perhaps representation. Boom, let's go down the line. What I always say to my clients, you need to connect the brain, the heart, the will. It is only when you really look at this journey about being a cultural change, where you have to move the hearts and the minds of people, that you start having success. So those are the aspects I liked very much about the story.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think it all resonates with us all in that regard. Bringing Dirk in now, and as Zoe was saying earlier, Dirk, you're a male ally. You'll understand, why this question is being addressed to you. Um, just the fact that you're on the Women in Business Executive Committee, as you were telling us in an earlier discussion, there's now a second male representative who's entered the committee, and we've seen the impact that that can have within our efforts at the INSEAD Gender Initiative, of course. So tell us, in terms of the role that you think men can play. We've seen a fantastic example in this particular case with Christoph and his involvement and how that made it a huge difference. What does it mean in practice, from your experience, for men to lean in? And perhaps what are some of the action steps that they can take?
Thank you, Vinika. It's a wonderful story. And, Christoph, the elements that Zoe brought up that made it kind of more natural for Christoph to actually take this step are absolutely valid. I think most of us indeed start building awareness around the topic of how important diversity and inclusion is, and equity for the same state, by what I would say a shocking experience. Now, I would like to flip the coin. As a man, or indeed as a human being, making equity work, taking the decision that you will allow talent that maybe did not have the conditions to develop itself that easily, if you as a leader actually support that talent to develop, I have wonderful news for you. The result is amazing and tremendously motivating. Many times it goes beyond your expectations. It's a belief, as Kay says, you say, go for it, be an ambassador. Being an ambassador was mostly originated in the fact that the first version of diversity lack we were seeing was gender, but it applies to all forms of diversity. The key motivator for many men is the excitement you feel when you have given support to that resource, how wonderfully that colleague or person develops. It becomes an experience of your jaw is dropping when you see how that person that gets your support flowers, shines, performs extraordinarily. So I would like to stress the positive motivator as a leader of choosing to go from equality to equity. So that's one observation. And the second observation from the case, when Zoe says, yeah, Christoph was invited in by Teresa and all the sessions, brings me to a very humble requirement. If you want to get all those benefits to your organization from being a diversity champion, it is about Christoph showing up, and it is that one dimension of inclusive leadership that we tend to not give full content, and it's called collaboration. Inclusive leaders truly collaborate, and it comes from the Latin word collaborare, which means work together. And inclusive leaders, they are capable to actually receive the bucket from some of their employees, do something and hand it back to their employees. Thereby they are experienced as authentically involved in the well-being and the work of their employees. And at the same time, you do need to invite your team members into your leadership task. As Zoe was saying, help me getting this to work. So this concept of collaboration in a very humble way is something that requires us to, as men, to actually have the opposite from what you described, Zoe, as this initial more male environment where you have to stand out. It actually requires you to be extremely humble. But I promise you, the benefits and the experience of seeing all that wonderful talent develop largely compensates whatever you might have anticipated.
Thank you. So the importance of moving from towards equity from equality, and the importance of collaboration. Certainly, we've seen that very well reflected in the work that you've done. So thank you for that, Dirk. Kay, moving to you and to your wonderful new book now, which I'm sure we're all very excited to be reading. So it talks about the what, why, and how of diversity. So can I ask you to elaborate a little bit on each of these and perhaps focus a little more on the how of diversity? I know areas like capability building and leadership effectiveness, for instance, are particularly relevant and useful for our audience. We've had some questions to that effect. So over to you for a little bit of an crash course on your book, a brief introduction, if you will.
Okay. So very briefly, just about the why and the what. What I see, and this book is really the result of working with and collaborating with more than 50 organizations on their diversity journey, and all with an aim to harness diversity for the objectives that they have, very much being aligned to their sustainability of the organization into the future. Now, what I have found from these journeys is it seems very simple, but many organizations start initiatives, actions, projects around equity, diversity, and inclusion without being able to be very clear about why they're doing that. And this becomes critical. I call it the strategic narrative for diversity. Everyone needs to get it in terms of why diversity is important for the very survival of our organization. When I talk about the what, it is about, so what do we mean by diversity? And I see a number of questions and answers. We're talking about people with disabilities, or we're talking about ethnicity, or we're talking about age. Well, it can be any of these things. But once you're clear about why diversity is important for your organization, you can define what elements of diversity are important, and then you can identify the gap. So many organizations, my research shows that more than 70% are not clear in these first two questions. But you were really asking about the how. And the how is really important because what you want to do is have continuity of diversity. It's not a project with a start and an end. Your diversity journey goes hand in hand with your growth as an organization and your developments. And what I've really found is that there are 6 capabilities that need to be in place. One of them we've spoken a little bit about and is connected to equity. One needs to be deeply mindful that there is unconscious bias that is inhibiting people coming into the organization and their development. So you have to manage it and lead it and minimize it. Secondly, you really need to have investments. The fact is that if you launch such a journey, to sustain it, you're going to have to develop leaders. You're going to have to measure. You have to monitor. You need to support your champions. So, diversity without investments around it and measuring the return is going to be difficult. The next one we spoke very much about in the case study. It's what I talk about behaviors and leadership. Leadership has a 70% impact on inclusion, and inclusion has an impact on whether you're getting the benefits of diversity. So leaders really need to be coached. What does it mean to be an inclusive leader? What does it mean to be committed and to intervene, to show up, as Dirk said? The next one that we have to look at is just the policies and processes. I've been examining organizations. Some have more than 100 different policies, which are in the drawer. They talk about a zero tolerance for discrimination, and yet it occurs and nothing happens. It is really pruning these policies to support your objectives. It is measuring all elements, not only diversity, but inclusion, about leadership, about results, and then it's celebrating. The fact is, a diversity journey is not easy. You know, for those who say there's a magic wand and it's all going to be great, they haven't seen the reality. It's difficult. So what you have to do is celebrate what is being achieved. You have to learn from your setbacks. So those are the 6 capabilities. And Vinica, you've been so generous to say to the audience that all these models that I'm talking about, they're going to be receiving a copy after the session.
Absolutely. We will definitely be sharing that as well as Zoe's slides with all the participants. I'm sure everyone's interested. We've already had some requests come in. So thank you for that, Kay. And, I think you've sort of crystallized everything in this 6-point framework, which is very interesting. As you were saying, we've had a number of comments and some queries from the audience about the other aspects of diversity. Of course, this case focuses on gender, but I'm sure you can all speak to the other aspects that some of our audience members have brought in. Lord is talking about the fact, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and forgive me if I'm not, but his point is on racial diversity, which is certainly very important in the Africa context. We've had questions about access for employees with disabilities, which again is an aspect of disability, an aspect of diversity, which Jagdish Rao, for instance, and Annie Archer are pointing out as being overlooked. So would any of you want to comment on these other aspects of diversity, which are very important, and what work is being done around that? Perhaps Kay, you can start, and then we can bring Zoe into the conversation.
Thank you so very much. In fact, Zoe and I had this discussion. Many organizations focus very much on the intervention dimension of gender diversity. And the reason is very practical. 50% of the world is gender. Many will claim that by focusing on gender, you start creating the conditions for other elements. I have to say I agree, and there is a major but. What you do see is that the other dimensions are not having the traction. A number of the listeners have talked about people with seen, unseen disabilities. 13% of our world population. If one actually looks at the initiatives and the progress over the last 40 years, it is lagging. You find that not enough robust focuses and commitment is being put in place. And so every time I'm doing interventions, I say, do not think that the advancement of peoples with disabilities diversity is going to be simply solved by looking at gender. It needs focus, and it needs metrics, and it needs someone to have courage and say, I am going to create the conditions for. So I'm pretty passionate about this point. And then I do want to respond to one thing that you've said, Vinica. In terms of race, ethnicity, yes, absolutely important for Africa, absolutely important for most of the countries in the world. And I think this is another thing that we haven't focused on, thankfully, with Black Lives Matter. I see certainly with the organizations that I support, that they are starting for the first time to do anti-racism, unconscious bias training around the stereotypes, how our colonial past and has influenced that. And I think it is something that we don't speak about. We push under the carpets, and we need to make it explicit. So would just like to talk about those two areas.
Thank you. And Zoe, I know this is close to your heart. You've done writing, you've done some research on this. So your comments, please.
Thank you, Vinica. I appreciate what you were sharing, Kay. And I don't think I can cover this in 5 minutes, so I'll try to do a very abbreviated version. I want to give, first of all, a shout out to my collaborator, Felicia Henderson, who has developed a really beautiful model for thinking about how to approach what matters in different contexts. Because as Kay was mentioning, gender is what we sometimes think of as the low-hanging fruit for diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there are women and men everywhere, and to a greater or lesser extent, it's the women who are underrepresented in positions of high earning and power. But to understand what matters in other contexts, we have to look at histories, and we have to look at who is currently getting smaller shares of the pie, so to speak, on a group level. And that requires thinking about histories of colonization. It requires thinking about patterns of immigration sometimes. It requires thinking about who are the powerful and who are the powerless in a current tribal system sometimes. I mean, really, we have to think about all of these elements, even when we're just talking about race, ethnicity, and linguistic diversity. So it's not easy, but we can, if we're devoted to figuring these challenges out, then we can look at the factors that influence historically and systemically, as well as how things are, how the power is distributed currently, to understand where we want to be paying attention with respect to these dimensions. So thank you for asking. Let's come back another time for a longer discussion on this one.
Indeed. And not an easy question to answer quickly, but appreciate the fact that you both tried. Thank you for that. I'm going to try and fit in one more question that came in ahead of time, actually, and this was from Eloy Santana, who's the executive president of COP-KISA. And he's struggling with the issue of a company that lacks diversity, especially at the more senior levels of management. And he gave some very interesting statistics in terms of how the topmost level of management in his company is basically 4 male civil engineers who all went to similar schools, grew up in the same kind of Catholic environment. And then even in the next level, it's mostly just male engineers. So his question is related to how can we handle this fact that it's at the top levels of management, the number of women goes down even more. So your comments on that, anything in terms of what he can do, some tips or suggestions on improving this leadership diversity at the topmost levels. Zoe, you perhaps first to start us off, and then we can ask Kay and Dirk to comment.
So noticing it and recognizing it is the first thing that we need to do. And then beyond that, we need to look at elements of both culture within our organization and also the systems and structures that we have in place in our organizational level, because both the culture and how those connect with psychological experiences. So really the three sort of angles on this that I think are most important are the culture, the psychological experiences that the culture creates, and the systems and structures that can be better suited to some profiles of individuals than to others. My 1-minute answer, but again, we could talk for 5 hours on this, so happy to engage more going forward. And read Kay's book.
Thank you, Zoe. Dirk, anything you want to add in 30 seconds?
Yeah, I would just invite the person who asked that question to think beyond the company. When you are in a sector that is quite still male, it works very well out to call your colleagues and take an industry-wide initiative. We have seen a lot of success in the financial sector through an organization called Women in Finance, and the financial institutions agreed that doing this together would substantially improve the situation of the industry. So my recommendation would be, don't stay only inside the walls of your company, look for industry-wide collaborations.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we've had some really useful insights on how to do exactly what the theme of International Women's Day 2022 was urging us to do, break biases and sort of do what we can in terms of empowering women all over the world. And also about how male allyship can go a long way towards making impactful and accelerated change. So I want to thank Zoe, Dirk, and Kay for your time and insightful sharing, and to our audience for being so actively engaged. Thank you for all the questions and comments, which our participants, our panelists have seen, and really good to see how interested you all are in this topic. Hopefully we will talk to you more about this. Lifelong Learning has some other wonderful webinars coming up. If you can put that slide up, our audience can have a quick look at some more that are coming in. In closing, once again, our thoughts and prayers are with everyone who's affected directly or indirectly by the war. Let's hope that peace can be speedily restored. Thank you for your time with us this evening.